Let's talk to Labour's Shadow Schools Minister Wes Streeting, who joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us now. A massive big issue over the reopening of schools, and Labour is urging the government to commit to reopening schools first when lockdown restrictions are eased. Can I just clarify though, am I not right in thinking the Prime Minister had already committed to opening schools first when lockdown restrictions were eased? Where is the difference between Labour and government policy on this issue?
Well, we thought the Prime Minister had committed to that, but yesterday when he was interviewed for a range of broadcasters in his Paul clip, he seemed to suggest in one breath that restrictions might start to ease from mid-February, but he couldn't guarantee reopening schools before Easter. And I think he sort of muddied the water there about where schools fall in the set of priorities. The second thing is that although we understand, I think everyone understands, that the restrictions are determined ultimately by infection rates overall, there are things the government can and should be doing now to make schools as safe as possible, as soon as possible. And at the moment, what concerns us, we don't have any clear criteria from the government about how they will determine when it's safe for all pupils to return to schools. And secondly, no plan in place to make those schools as safe as possible, putting in place the safety measures that will give parents and staff the confidence that schools are safe places for all children to be learning.
Well, schools went back last September and they were safe places for children to be learning, weren't they? What other safety measures do you want in place?
Well, it's been a bit of a disaster overall. We've had the hokey cokey on schools throughout the last year and the hokey cokey on restrictions, but there are things the government can and should be doing. We were calling for months for a rollout of mass testing in schools. The government announced they would do that on the last day of term before Christmas, and then it was an absolute disaster in terms of rollout in January. So the government could be using this time now.
How was it a disastrous rollout? The kids went back to school for one day.
Well, it's part of the disaster, Julia, to be honest.
Let me clarify. It was a disaster because children should have been in school, or what?
Well, just
because the last time I looked, Labour supported kids not getting a proper education in school. Is that not Labour policy? I mean, I know there's been a lot of fence sitting by Keir Starmer, but correct me if I'm wrong, Labour Party supports children not being in schools right now. So how could the government be rolling out a mass testing policy?
Well, firstly, having mass testing in school is a logistical challenge. So you have to get the testing capacity in place. That's what, the disaster was at the beginning of January, because the government had announced a half-baked plan on the last day of term before Christmas. And then the rollout was something of a disaster at the beginning of January. So government should be acting on that. And look, secondly, Julia, just on this broader point about children learning, we all believe that it's in the best interests of children to be in school and learning. We also recognise that at the moment, because of the prevalence of the virus, that's just not possible.
But I don't know, we don't all recognise that. I think you're quite wrong.
Most people recognise it. Sorry. I think most people recognise. So I should remember. I'm talking to.
Remember, you're talking to someone who cares about children who aren't getting. I mean, I thought the whole point of the Labour Party was that you cared about people who were disadvantaged. The whole point of the campaign is you're the nice people, and you care about people who are at the bottom of the pile, the poorest kids, and disadvantage and inequality. And you want those kids to have the best start in life. Well, those kids aren't getting the best start in life. I'm sure your kid's doing just fine. My kid's doing just fine. Millions of children who are not getting a proper education, haven't got broadband, haven't got a laptop. Yep, blame the government for that. But either way, they're sitting at home, 3 kids in a tower block flat. Those kids aren't getting an education. Those kids are being disadvantaged. Why should those children's futures be sacrificed for other people?
Well, you're absolutely right about the risk in terms of disadvantage, Julia, and it's, by the way, not just children from the most disadvantaged background that would be really suffering as a result of lockdown. I think most kids, most parents are finding this hard. So we all accept that. Of course,
but you still support the policy.
But that's why getting schools back as soon as possible, as safely as possible.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means having a clear plan in place for the rollout of mass testing, having school staff on the vaccinations list, properly ventilated classrooms with extra capacity if needed, clear guidance around the use of face masks, particularly in secondary schools. There are loads of things the government can and should be doing to make schools safe. So we're not.
So all of those things could be done straight away. So schools could reopen in a week. If the government could get all of those things in place, you'd support schools reopening in a week. Or would you still sit on the fence on that one?
as I say, because it's also about the criteria the government used to determine when schools open. So, of course,
No, that's the government's position. I want to know what Labour's position is. Do you want schools to reopen at the earliest opportunity or not? What are your criteria for schools reopening? And saying as safe as possible. Well, other than making big plastic bubbles or hazmat suits for every single person, you're not going to have 100% safety for every single person. So what are Labour's criteria for schools reopening?
Ultimately, it's about the transmission of the virus in the wider community, the trajectory of infections, and that's got to be determined by independent scientific advice. So that should inform the criteria the government uses to determine when it's safe to open schools to all people.
Well, fundamentally, it's a political decision, isn't it? You get scientific advice. The scientific advice shouldn't determine things. It should advise the elected, accountable politicians making those decisions.
And at the moment, those elected, accountable politicians in government aren't telling us what criteria they are using to make a decision about when schools open. So, of course, it's got to be determined by the scientific advice. That informs government policy. At the moment, we don't know what the government's policy is about when to open schools, depending on what the transmission rates are. But also, secondly, the government can and should be acting now to put in place the safety measures that, frankly, teachers have been crying out for the best part of a year now. So that's where we are, and that's why we're saying schooling should be a priority, and that's what we want to see from the government.
And can I also ask you about this ongoing row with the EU and AstraZeneca over the rollout of the vaccine supplies? The EU now threatening to basically put in very thinly veiled suggestions of export bans on jabs going to third countries, including the UK, when the EU is in such short supply. You were someone who campaigned for Remain during the Brexit referendum, supported Remain. Do you think that now, in retrospect, actually Brexit was a jolly good idea, given that it's meant that we've been able to roll out our vaccine? And what do you make of the EU possibly wanting to ban exports of the life-saving vaccine to the UK?
Well, I think all countries, including our own, are focused on making sure that we get the vaccine rolled out to our own people as quickly as possible. So I think we just need to look very carefully at what the EU's sort of position is and how that might impact on us. My understanding is that there's a lot of vaccine manufactured here in the UK, so I hope that we wouldn't be affected by it. I think more broadly, I think we just got to guard against vaccine protectionism a bit. We are ultimately all in this together across the world, and we need strong international cooperation, because beyond our own shores and our own borders, obviously our own people come first. The people expect that of government, quite rightly. But ultimately, we are in a global environment, and we know that what happens in other countries will affect ours ultimately.
So the EU would be wrong to have an export ban on AstraZeneca supplies going to the UK or elsewhere?
Well,
I mean, based on what you just said, you think they'd be wrong?
I'm a Brit, so of course I'm going to argue what's in Britain's national interests.
So the EU would be wrong to do that?
Sure. If I were living on the continent, and I think that's really what some of the noise coming from the European Commission is about. They're speaking to their own citizens and to their own domestic audiences when there are elections coming up in a number of EU member states. So I kind of understand the politics of that, but ultimately, I'm interested.
So speaking as a British MP, the EU would be wrong to ban exports of the AstraZeneca jab to the UK.
If it affects us, yes, of course I'd say they're wrong, because I care about our country and getting the vaccine rolled out as soon as possible.
Good to hear, Wes Streeting. Real pleasure to have your company. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.